April 18, 1943. Dawn breaks over the skies of Bremen, Germany. The air is still, but the sound of approaching engines rolls like distant thunder. The Luftwaffe pilots, stationed at airfields just outside the city, climb into their cockpits with confidence. They have faced American bombers before, lumbering B-17s and B-24s pushing deep into Reich territory, and they have torn them apart, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swooping like hawks into a scattered flock. Cigarette smoke lingers in the ready rooms, jokes about the clumsy American escorts still echoing in the barracks. To them, the Mustang was nothing but an underpowered curiosity, a failure that had stumbled in the deserts of North Africa. They laughed at its fragile wings and its weak Allison engine. They believed nothing had changed. Bundesarchiv Luftwaffe Diary Entry 1943. But then the formation appeared on the horizon. Silhouettes against the rising sun. First the heavy bombers, their contrails stretching white across the blue, and then something else, sleek shapes keeping pace with the flying fortresses. Long-range fighters where there should have been none. Their wings glinted like polished steel, their noses painted with snarling mouths and checkerboard patterns. They flew higher, faster, with a confidence the Germans did not expect. When the first wave of Messerschmitt Bf-109s clawed into the sky to intercept, they found themselves not against helpless bombers, but against hunters waiting for them. U.S. 8th Air Force Combat Report, April 1943. The battle was chaos. Cannon shells ripped through the air, tracers stitched across the clouds. German pilots dove, only to find the new American escorts cutting across their paths with impossible speed. The P-51s, redesigned and reborn, could turn inside the Focke-Wulf 190s, could climb with them, could chase them even as they tried to escape toward the safety of their own bases. Over the radios, panic spread. "For they are everywhere," one pilot cried before his signal dissolved into static. RFY Service Intercept Log 1943. The Americans, once the prey, were now the predators. By 10 a.m., the skies above Bremen were littered with burning wreckage. Black plumes marked the graves of machines that had once ruled the Reich's skies. The bombers pressed on, their tight formations still intact, their gunners scanning but no longer isolated. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's tried-and-true strategy, bleeding the bombers before they reached their targets, was failing. The Mustang had arrived, and with it, the balance of the air war shifted. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. To understand this moment, one must return to the roots of the conflict. By 1942, the Allies faced a bitter dilemma. The United States had committed to daylight bombing over Europe, promising precision strikes against the industrial heart of Germany. It was a doctrine rooted in confidence, in technology, in faith that defensive formations of heavily armed bombers could punch through enemy skies. Yet reality told a different story. Without long-range fighter escorts, the bombers bled white. In August 1943, during the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, 60 of 376 bombers never returned, men and machines swallowed by the Reich's air defenses. U.S. Army Air Force's after-action report, AUG 1943. American commanders knew that such losses could not be sustained. General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, pleaded for a solution. The British had their Spitfires and Hurricanes, superb in combat but short-legged, unable to reach Berlin and return. The Americans had tried the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt, both deadly in the right hands, but stretched to their limits when tasked with escorting bombers across Germany's vast airspace. Time and again, formations were left unprotected over the critical targets, and time and again, the Luftwaffe's seasoned Jagdgeschwader struck with merciless precision. Royal Air Force Intelligence Summary 1943. And yet, behind factory doors in Britain and design offices in America, a transformation was underway. The P-51 Mustang, first built at the request of the Royal Air Force, had been dismissed as inadequate. Its early Allison engine lacked high-altitude performance, rendering it unsuitable for the very battles that mattered. But engineers, men like Edgar Schmood at North American Aviation, refused to give up. They saw potential in the Mustang's airframe, its laminar flow wing design, its range. The answer came not from California, but from Derby, England, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. When married to the Mustang, it unlocked a fighter that could climb, dive, and strike at the very limits of range and endurance. North American Aviation Development Memo 1942, the Luftwaffe, confident in its dominance, did not yet realize what was coming. German intelligence reports in late 1942 barely mentioned the Mustang, dismissing it as negligible in performance. OKL Intelligence Summary, DES 1942. But in America and Britain, production lines roared to life. Workers, many of them women newly recruited into wartime industry, riveted panels, tested engines, and painted insignias onto aircraft that would soon carry the war to the Reich's heart. The Mustang was no longer an afterthought. It was becoming a weapon of vengeance. By early 1944, the situation was dire for Germany. The Eastern Front devoured divisions by the month. Allied troops in Italy pressed northward, and in the skies, the relentless bombing campaign threatened to cripple German industry. Yet for all the destruction, the Americans still lacked the ability to strike deep with impunity. Bomber crews whispered of flak alleys and fighter walls, knowing that every mission beyond the Rhine meant flying into a gauntlet. Morale wavered. Letters home carried not bravado but grim resignation. "If something doesn't change," one navigator wrote in December 1943, "we won't last until spring." Personal letter, 8th Air Force Navigator, Deck 1943. Something did change. When the P-51B and later the P-51D entered service, suddenly the bombers were no longer abandoned over enemy territory. Mustang pilots could stick with them all the way to Berlin and back, turning the tables on the Luftwaffe. The psychological shift was immediate. American airmen, once expecting slaughter, now carried a new weapon and a new hope. 8th Air Force Morale Report, Jan 1944. The Germans, who had once laughed at the Mustang, would soon find themselves fighting for survival in skies they had once commanded. But that revelation, that hidden advantage of design and endurance, is only the beginning. To truly understand why the Luftwaffe's laughter turned to dread, one must look closer. Into the heart of the machine, the engineering that gave it wings, and the battle that proved its worth beyond all doubt. That story waits in the next chapter, where the secret of the Mustang is revealed, and where the air war over Europe reaches its decisive turning point. January 29, 1944. Dawn over Frankfurt. Snow lies heavy across the airfields, muffling the world. But inside the cockpits of B-17's, engines roar to life, churning the cold into fire and thunder. The crews know what awaits them. They have flown too many missions without enough protection. The names of lost friends haunt them, written in chalk on briefing boards, whispered in the mess halls. But this morning, as the sun rises behind their wings, something new glides into the sky alongside them. Sleek, silver, and lethal, the P-51 Mustang. The bombers watch as these fighters take their positions on the outer edges of the formation, their pilots confident. Their range long enough to promise, "We will not leave you." U.S. 8th Air Force Combat Report, Jan 1944. The Mustang's secret lay not in myth but in engineering. Its laminar flow wing, first tested in the late 1930s, sliced through the air with minimal drag, granting greater range and speed than any fighter of its generation. When North American aviation's chief designer Edgar Schmude coupled this frame with the Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine, the result was staggering. At 25,000 feet, where bombers flew and battles were decided, the Merlin delivered power the old Allison engine never could. The Mustang now reached speeds of 440 miles per hour, climbed at 3,200 feet per minute, and could escort bombers over 1,600 miles, deep into the Reich and back. Technical Manual TM 91275, 1944. The Luftwaffe had assumed that American fighters could not endure long-range escort missions. The P-47 Thunderbolt, powerful but thirsty, lacked the legs to stay beyond central Germany. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning fared better, but suffered in the cold, its turbochargers unreliable at the highest altitudes of the bomber streams. German commanders calculated their defenses accordingly. "Strike the bombers when they are naked," one Jagdgeschwader leader explained. "Their fighters will turn back before we engage." Luftwaffe Tactical Memo 1943. But now that assumption collapsed. The Mustang shattered the Luftwaffe's timing, its very doctrine of interception. Every feature of the P-51 reflected this new role. Its 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, carrying 1,880 rounds, could cut through the armored fuselages of German bombers and fighters alike. Its self-sealing fuel tanks, backed by careful design, extended survival when enemy fire found its mark. External drop tanks added hundreds of miles to its range, enabling it to linger even over Berlin. Allied factories from Inglewood, California to Dallas, Texas, worked around the clock. By mid-1944, nearly 15,000 Mustangs rolled out of production lines, each one a promise of air dominance. North American Aviation Production Report, 1944. The Luftwaffe's disbelief was recorded in their own words. A dramatized composite account from a German ace recalled, "They should not have been there. We climbed, expecting the bombers alone, and suddenly the Mustangs were diving through our formation. Fast, always fast. It was like being hunted by shadows that never tired." Bundesarchiv, Pilot Diary, Fragments, 1944. For men who once laughed at the Mustang, the laughter curdled into rage and fear. The Reich skies, once theirs, now belonged to these silent escorts. It was on March 6, 1944 that the Mustang proved its worth beyond all doubt. The mission, the first full-scale daylight raid on Berlin. Nearly 730 bombers of the 8th Air Force roared eastward from England, their contrails stretching across the Channel like banners of defiance. For weeks, Luftwaffe propaganda had declared that no American bomber would ever survive to strike the Reich's capital. The challenge was bold, almost reckless, and yet this time, the bombers did not go alone. More than 800 fighters, among them hundreds of P-51s, spread their wings in escort. U.S. Army Air Force's Operations Report, March 1944. As the bomber stream crossed into Germany, radar stations picked up the wave. Sirens wailed. Squadrons of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs scrambled from bases ringing the capital. Their mission was simple: tear the formation apart before it reached the city. But the Mustangs were waiting. Over Hanover, the first clash erupted. German fighters dove from above, only to find their prey shielded by Mustangs slashing upward. In moments, the air dissolved into duels, spirals of contrails, bursts of cannon fire, and machines falling in flame. 8th Air Force Combat Report, March 1944. The Mustangs did what no escort had done before. They pursued. They did not merely defend the bombers. They chased the attackers back toward their own airfields. Pilots like Clarence Bud Anderson and Don Gentile turned their squadrons into predators. Anderson would later recall, "It was like cutting wolves off from the flock. We weren't waiting anymore. We were hunting." Anderson Oral History Interview, 1983. That day, the 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers, a terrible cost, yet far less than feared. In return, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 160 aircraft, many of them irreplaceable veteran pilots. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The Mustang's dominance was not merely in numbers, but in tactics. Its high speed allowed bounce attacks, diving from altitude with devastating surprise. Its agility let pilots break from defensive formations, strike and rejoin in moments. German after-action reports lamented, "They do not tire, they do not leave. Wherever we go, they are already there." Luftwaffe Situation Report, March 1944. For the first time, American bombers pressed into the Reich's core with a shield strong enough to reach the target and return. Factories in Germany burned that day. Smoke curled from Siemens, Daimler-Benz, and armament works scattered across Berlin. Civilians fled into bunkers as the thunder of high explosives shook the city. For the Reich's leadership, the raid was a revelation. The capital was no longer immune. Hitler's Reichsmarschall, Hermann Göring, was reported to have stared into the sky in fury, declaring, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Behind the battlefield, the Mustang story was also one of labor and invention. Engineers at Rolls-Royce had perfected the Merlin engine, adapting superchargers for high-altitude endurance. American technicians retooled assembly lines to merge British ingenuity with American scale. Women riveters, African-American laborers in segregated plants, immigrant machinists, all became part of the silent army that birthed the Mustang. Every bolt they tightened carried across the Atlantic to change the war's outcome. Office of War Production Report, 1944. Yet even as the Allies celebrated, the Luftwaffe reeled. Its fighter arm was stretched to breaking. Losses of aircraft were one thing. Losses of veteran pilots were another. Training schools could not replace experience. By spring 1944, the average Luftwaffe pilot entering combat had barely 160 flying hours, compared to over 400 for his American counterpart. The skies were becoming a graveyard for Germany's youth. German Air Force Training Memo, 1944. The Mustang was more than a machine. It was a symbol. To American bomber crews, it meant salvation. To German pilots, it meant death circling silently in the blue. And to strategists on both sides, it meant the turning tide of the air war. The laughter that once greeted its name had vanished. Now there was only the grim recognition of what it represented, an enemy that could no longer be outrun, a shadow that would follow them to the very heart of Berlin. And yet, the story does not end with Berlin. For the Mustang's presence reshaped not only battles, but entire strategies. It forced the Luftwaffe into defense, drained German industry, and lifted Allied morale skyward. To see its true impact, one must follow its legacy beyond the battlefield, into the factories, the minds of airmen, and the very psychology of war itself. By the summer of 1944, the Reich's skies had changed forever. What once had been the hunting grounds of the Luftwaffe had become a killing field where German pilots fell in flames. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang had not only altered tactics but rewritten the very strategy of the air war. Where once bomber crews prayed for survival, now they flew with a guardian presence at their side, their silver escorts stretching the boundaries of possibility. U.S. Army Air Force's Morale Report, July 1944. The strategic consequences unfolded with brutal speed. The Luftwaffe, already strained by losses on the Eastern Front, now found itself locked in a war of attrition it could not win. Each day, new bomber raids struck deeper, targeting aircraft factories at Regensburg, ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, and fuel refineries at Leuna. The Mustangs made it possible. By denying the Luftwaffe its old hunting patterns, they forced German commanders to commit fighters under disadvantageous terms. Every raid drained reserves. Every skirmish cost not just machines but irreplaceable men. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The impact on morale was profound. Among American bomber crews, the phrase "little friends" became shorthand for the Mustangs streaking above them. Veterans described the relief of seeing their silhouettes appear after hours of exposure. When the Mustangs arrived, it felt like the sun coming out, one B-17 gunner recalled. We knew we weren't alone anymore. Oral History Collection, 8th Air Force Museum. The psychological shield was as important as the physical one. Men fought harder when they believed they had a chance to live. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological effect was the opposite. Veteran German pilots, once so confident, began writing of exhaustion, dread, and resignation. A dramatized composite diary entry noted, "They circle us like wolves. We dive, they follow. We climb, they climb higher. There is no escape." Bundesarchiv, Pilot Notes 1944. Göring's infamous remark that the sight of Mustangs over Berlin meant the war was lost was not mere rhetoric. It was the voice of a commander watching his force disintegrate before his eyes. The statistics were merciless. Between February and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 2,000 fighter aircraft over Western Europe. Pilot losses ran even higher, with over 25% of the veteran cadre killed or captured. By comparison, Mustang squadrons often achieved kill ratios of 5-1, sometimes even higher during well-coordinated sweeps. 8th Air Force Loss and Claims Report 1944. Each victory did more than protect a bomber. It hollowed out Germany's ability to resist. Behind the front lines, engineers and technicians sustained the momentum. Field maintenance crews learned to swap Merlin engines under canvas tents, keeping fighters flying day after day, despite attrition. Logisticians coordinated shipments of drop tanks, ammunition belts, and spare parts across the Atlantic, ensuring that the Mustang remained not just a machine of brilliance, but of reliability. U.S. Army Air Force's Maintenance Bulletin 1944. In total war, it was not only pilots who fought, but the hands of thousands of mechanics, riveters, and machinists. Without them, the sky would have gone dark. Strategically, the Mustang enabled a shift in Allied doctrine. With air superiority growing, the Allies no longer limited themselves to defending bomber streams. Mustang squadrons began aggressive fighter sweeps, striking German airfields, before enemy aircraft could even take off. The hunters became hunted in their own homes. This forced the Luftwaffe into a defensive crouch, scrambling to survive rather than dictating the tempo. U.S. Tactical Air Operations Report, ARG 1944. By D-Day, the skies over Normandy belonged to the Allies. The Wehrmacht, deprived of reconnaissance and interdiction, fought blind beneath a sky ruled by Mustangs. The effect rippled across campaigns. In Normandy, German armor attempting to move by day was shredded by Allied fighter bombers. In Italy, supply lines cracked under the constant threat of strafing runs. In the east, Soviet pilots benefited indirectly, as Luftwaffe reinforcements could no longer be spared from the Western Front. The Mustang's presence was not confined to duels in the stratosphere. It shaped the very movement of armies on the ground. U.S. War Department Analysis, 1945. Equally powerful was the human element. The Mustang turned young American pilots into aces. Men like George Preddy, who scored 26.83 kills, or Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, carved their reputations in its cockpit. Their names became symbols for bomber crews, who whispered them in admiration. German pilots, meanwhile, watched as their own heroes fell one by one. The loss of legends like Walter Nowotny and Egon Meyer further crushed morale. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. But the Mustang story was not one of triumph alone. Its victories came at a terrible cost. Thousands of young men still never returned from the skies, their planes spiraling into fields and forests across Europe. Every advance in air superiority demanded sacrifice. Engineers, too, carried burdens. Each design flaw corrected, each production delay overcome, marked by sleepless nights and relentless pressure. Their contribution, though invisible, was as essential as the pilot's courage. Office of War Production Records, 1944. The Mustang's legacy did not end with the fall of the Reich. Its lessons carried forward into the Cold War. Air forces around the world embraced the doctrine it symbolized. Long-range strike, supported by enduring escort, with speed and endurance outweighing raw firepower. The Korean War saw Mustangs once again in action, strafing and supporting troops on the ground. In the jet age, its philosophy, flexibility, range, dominance, lived on in designs like the F-86 Sabre and eventually the F-15 Eagle. U.S. Air Force Doctrine Memo, Taiwan. Psychologically, the Mustang proved a universal truth. In war, confidence is as deadly a weapon as steel. By sustaining Allied morale and breaking that of the Luftwaffe, it magnified its material impact 100-fold. The Mustang was not only an aircraft, but a symbol of inevitability. For German civilians, its contrails meant bombs would fall again. For Allied soldiers, it meant the tide was turning. For the world, it meant that technology, mass production, and strategy had combined to break a once-feared enemy. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. As the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, Mustangs flew overhead in victory parades, their silhouettes a reminder of the long struggle. The laughter of German pilots at the failed American fighter had turned to silence, buried under wreckage and defeat. The Mustang had carried the bombers to Berlin, and with them, the weight of Allied vengeance. In the end, one phrase attributed to a weary Luftwaffe veteran captured the truth of the Mustang's reign. The bombers destroyed our cities, but the Mustangs destroyed our soul. Interrogation report. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. And so the lesson endures. In modern war, it is not only firepower that decides the outcome, but endurance, connection, and the will to protect. The P-51 Mustang proved that speed could outrun arrogance, and that steel wings guided by determined men could tilt the balance of history itself.